Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today's topic is American slavery and American freedom. As always, there are some key terms at the top of this slide you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is over. There are also some questions you should be able to answer by the last slide as well. So that said, let's get to it. When it comes to race, American history becomes a bit confusing. Actually, the facts seem to contradict one another. For example, the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important documents in American history, declares that all men are created equal. Yet the man who wrote those words, Thomas Jefferson, was a slaveholder. Another contradiction is that the American Revolution was a war fought to free the American colonies from what they saw as British tyranny. And yet, 8 out of the nation's first 12 presidents were slaveholders, and slavery was in fact legal in all 13 colonies at the time the war was fought. Sometimes it seems as if slavery was ingrained in the American past. Yet one of the questions scholars studying U.S. history have to confront is whether or not African slavery was inevitable. Most scholars today say no, it was not inevitable. To better understand this question, let's consider the history of slavery before America was even founded. Slavery had been a part of European history since Greek and Roman times, in other words, thousands of years. Yet by the 1600s, it was starting to die as an institution. A lot of that had to do with Christianity. Christians believed that it was wrong to enslave other Christians. As Europe became almost 100% Christian, this destroyed slavery on the continent. The discovery and colonization of America by Europeans revived slavery, however. This was initially begun by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were the first European folks to actually try to settle in the Americas. So why did they bring slavery with them? If slavery was dying in Europe, why did the Spanish and the Portuguese revive slavery in their American colonies? For one thing, the new peoples that were quote-unquote discovered in the New World were not Christians. Thus, the prohibition against enslaving Christians did not apply in the Americas. In fact, the Spanish almost immediately began enslaving native peoples once they established their colonies in the Americas. They did it because they needed the labor. Indian slaves were put to work growing food for the Spanish and mining gold and silver. The work was incredibly hard, and many native peoples died. As the image above indicates, Indians who revolted against this system were punished severely. The engraving shows the Spanish cutting off the hands of rebellious Indian slaves. In other cases, rebellious slaves were hung, or in some cases even burned alive. The English are going to establish Jamestown in the year 1607. Like the Spanish, they needed workers to do the dirty work of getting the colony going. Indian slavery was not really an option for the English, however, at least not at first. The Powhatans were simply too strong. Moreover, the colonists were very, very weak. Remember our discussion of early Jamestown. Most colonists died from disease, and even more died from starvation. The consequence was that it was really, really hard to convince English people to migrate to America. It was very hard, in other words, to convince English laborers to come to the New World to do the work that the colony needed to survive. This is going to pose a problem for Jamestown, especially after tobacco came to become a valuable crop. Tobacco needs laborers. People were needed to plant the tobacco, they were needed to tend the plants, and they were needed to harvest them. Then they were needed to dry and cure the tobacco so that it could be sold. Without labor, tobacco would be a failure, and the colony would probably collapse. Thus, when a Dutch cargo ship arrived at Jamestown in the year 1619 with a cargo of 20 captive Africans, The colonists were glad to trade some of their precious food supplies for these Africans. But please don't jump to any conclusions about who these 20 African laborers were. While we might assume that these people were slaves, we don't know that. The records are simply unclear. It is possible that these laborers were sold to the colonists as indentured servants and not as slaves. But what was an indentured servant? Indentured servitude was similar to the practice of apprenticeship back in Europe. An apprentice was an individual who would sign a contract with another. This other person would be known as his or her master, to apprentice him or herself out for a set period of time. Ideally, the apprentice would learn a trade while the master got cheap labor. All he would have to do was feed and house his apprentice. Indentured servitude was similar to apprenticeship in theory. A poor young man or woman would sell his or her labor to a wealthy landowner in Virginia in exchange for passage to America. Typically, the poor young man or woman would sign a contract of indenture promising to work for his or her master for a specified period of time. It might be a period of 5 years, it might be 10 years, it all depended on the contract. Now, in theory, this was a great deal for both parties. Both sides got something out of this. Landowners got cheap labor. Migrants got a fresh start in America. Unfortunately, the reality was something very, very different, however. That's because life as an indentured servant in America was hell. First of all, the servants experienced the same problems as other migrants to Virginia. Many got sick and many died. Others starved to death, just like the regular colonists were getting sick or starving to death. Still, the hardest part of being an indentured servant was the work. Many masters, eager to get as much labor out of their servants before their contract was up, would work their servants to death. In fact, one historian argues that only about 50%, or half, of all indentured servants survived their contracts. Life was so bad that many indentured servants ran away. Some tried to blend into colonial society. Others ran away to live with local Indian tribes. Running away was dangerous, however. A captured servant could be severely whipped or even branded as a runaway. He or she might also have years added to their contract. So, why become an indentured servant at all? Many believed that if they could survive, they would also be able to buy land and get rich off tobacco. Initially, laws were passed that required that servants who survived their contract be given land, seed, and tools to get started on their own. Some former indentured servants rose to become some of the most prominent members of Virginia society. So, what is the connection between indentured servitude and slavery? Well, first of all, most indentured servants were white. Please note that I said most indentured servants were white. The records from Virginia show that some Africans were also sold as indentured servants and not as slaves. In fact, there is evidence that some black indentured servants survived their contract to become landowners in Virginia themselves. Some even bought their own indentured servants and became relatively wealthy. Throughout most of the first century of Virginia's existence, indentured servants were the preferred source of labor. Why? Well, actually, it makes perfect sense. One obvious advantage was that an indentured servant usually spoke English. Moreover, he or she was familiar with English culture. Thus, they fit into Jamestown society rather easily. Another reason was practical. Indentured servants were cheaper than slaves. That's because slaves would serve for life. Thus, they cost more. This was an important consideration in the early days of Jamestown, when the chances of surviving more than a few years were slim. Why invest in a slave who would probably die within a year or two? Indentured servants were simply a better value. This begins to change by the beginning of the 1700s, when slavery was beginning to become a more attractive option for landowners in Virginia and throughout the colonies. Why? Well, for one thing, the colonies had become more stable by 1700. People were not dying as quickly as they had in the first few decades of the colony. Thus, slaves became a better value. This was especially true when slaves had children of their own. One big advantage of slavery was that a child born to a slave was also a slave. This was not true of an indentured servant. If a female indentured servant had a child, that child was a free laborer, not an indentured servant. Another big advantage was race. As African slavery grew more popular as a system of labor in the colonies, skin color came to define a person's status. This made it more difficult for an African slave to run away, unlike white indentured servants. Remember, I said that white indentured servants often ran away and they could just melt into colonial society. They looked like everybody else. An African indentured servant, or I'm sorry, an African slave, however, if he or she ran away, they easily stood out due to their skin color. A final advantage involved land. Once an indentured servant was freed, he or she often demanded land to get started farming. That wasn't a big deal early on in Virginia's history, as most servants failed to survive their contracts. Most died before they became free. Moreover, for those who did survive their contract, there was a lot of land to spare. However, as the population began to grow, and as indentured servants began to outlive their contract, available land became scarce. Slaves, on the other hand, would never be freed. Thus, they never demanded land. Young men without land or jobs could be dangerous. In 1676, a group of former indentured servants overthrew the colonial government in what today is known as Bacon's Rebellion. So now let's shift our focus just a little bit. Now that we've come to understand labor in Virginia, let's try to understand how slaves got to the Americas. The answer, of course, is the African slave trade, which was part of a three-legged journey known as the triangular trade. Now let's trace each leg of this triangular trade. The first leg of this triangle would be from Europe to Africa. The trade would begin in Europe, where manufactured goods like guns, iron pots, steel axes, etc. were shipped to Africa. In Africa, these goods were traded for slaves. Typically, the actual capture of slaves would be done by Africans living along the coast. The African coastal states would stage raids on tribes living far inland. They would bring these slaves to the coast, where they were traded to the Europeans. And again, in exchange for the slaves, the Africans would receive these manufactured goods. They would receive guns. They would receive metal knives. They would receive metal pots. So this was the first part of the trade. Once a slave ship was full, it would then set sail for America, typically North or South America and the Caribbean, where they would be traded, slaves I should say. The slaves would be traded for raw materials like sugar, rice, or tobacco. These raw materials would then be taken back to Europe, the final leg in our triangle, where the cycle would begin all over again. So in other words, let's just repeat this one more time. The first leg of the triangle would be manufactured goods made in Europe and shipped south to Africa. There, these manufactured goods would be traded to African coastal tribes in exchange for slaves. These slaves would be taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, where they would be traded for raw materials like sugar or tobacco. The sugar and tobacco would then be shipped back across the Atlantic in the final leg of our triangle, back to Europe, where the whole cycle would begin all over again. Okay, so hopefully we understand the triangle.